Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? The old asylum sat on the edge of town, its crumbling brick walls barely visible through the overgrown trees that surrounded it. I had heard the stories, of course, about how the place had been shut down decades ago, its dark history a mix of horror and tragedy. No one had dared step inside for years. The gates had been rusted shut, the windows boarded up, and the walls had started to blend into the wild foliage that had crept in. It was an unsettling place, a reminder of a past long forgotten and best left undisturbed. But I didn't listen to the warnings. I couldn't resist. The allure of the unknown, the curiosity that gnawed at the back of my mind, pulled me toward it. The asylum had become something of a legend, a place that no one talked about anymore, but couldn't quite forget. The moment I stepped through the broken gate, I could feel the air change, thick with the weight of memories I couldn't see, only feel. The building loomed before me, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring back. The main entrance door was ajar, barely hanging on, its hinges as if inviting me to enter. I paused for a moment, unsure if I should go any further, but the lure of the asylum's secrets was too strong. I pushed the door open, its screeching protest cutting through the silence like a warning. Inside, the darkness was almost complete. The only light coming from the dim glow of the sun filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with dust and the unmistakable smell of mildew, decay, and something I couldn't quite place. The floor was littered with broken glass, scattered papers, and the remnants of forgotten lives. The walls, once white, were now streaked with grime, their peeling paint revealing a history of neglect. I stepped cautiously inside, my footsteps soft against the dust-coated floor. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that fills every space with an eerie weight. I could feel the house's history in the air, the lingering presence of those who had been confined here, who had lived and died behind these walls. I didn't know what I expected to find, but it wasn't this. It was as if the asylum had frozen in time, as though the world outside had forgotten about it, but the place itself had remembered everything. I moved down the long corridor, the faint sound of my breath and the creaking of the floorboards the only noise. The doors on either side of me were mostly shut, their hinges rusted and stiff, but one stood slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room inside was a small office, the desk cluttered with papers, many of which were too damaged to read. But as my eyes scanned the room, something caught my attention. In the far corner of the room, a photograph hung crookedly on the wall. It was old, the edges curling with age. The image was of a woman dressed in a white hospital gown, her face pale and hollow. She stared back at me with wide, fearful eyes. I stepped closer, studying the picture, but as I did, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something wrong with her expression. The fear in her eyes was too real, too raw. Suddenly, a loud, piercing scream echoed from deep within the asylum. I froze. It wasn't just any scream. It was a scream of pure agony, desperate and filled with terror, as though someone or something was in unbearable pain. My heart raced as the scream echoed again, bouncing off the walls and reverberating through the building. I didn't know who or what it was, but it sounded too real to be a figment of my imagination. I rushed out of the room, my breath quick and shallow, and followed the sound down the corridor. The scream seemed to be coming from deeper inside the asylum, from somewhere I couldn't see. The hallways twisted and turned, and the deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. The rooms, once classrooms and offices, now seemed like forgotten tombs, abandoned, full of remnants of the past, but empty of life. As I turned a corner, I saw it. The source of the scream, a large room, its door wide open, the inside shrouded in darkness. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, until I was standing in the threshold. The room was vast, but what struck me was the smell, a pungent, metallic scent that burned my nostrils. The floor was littered with broken furniture, old hospital beds, and worn sheets that had turned yellow with age. But it wasn't the room itself that made me stop. It was what was in it. A figure, hunched over, trembling uncontrollably, in the center of the room. A woman, her hair matted and wild, her white hospital gown tattered and stained. She was rocking back and forth, her hands clutching her head as she screamed again, a guttural, heart-wrenching cry that made my skin crawl. "Please, help me," she moaned, her voice broken, desperate. But it wasn't just the words that sent chills through me. It was her eyes. She looked directly at me, her gaze wild and full of unspoken terror. Her eyes were filled with a madness that made me feel like I was staring into something far darker than just a human mind. She didn't seem to see me fully, or maybe she did, but her eyes were too lost in whatever nightmare she was reliving. I tried to move closer, to ask her what had happened, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath fog in front of me. The woman let out another scream, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to shift. The walls of the room seemed to stretch, to warp, as though the asylum itself was alive, reacting to her pain. And then, just as suddenly as the scream had started, it stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence. I blinked, disoriented, and when I looked back, the woman was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. The room was empty, just a wreckage of broken furniture and dust. The only thing left was the faint echo of her scream, lingering in the walls. My body was trembling as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. I turned and ran. I didn't know how I found my way out, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was escaping the asylum, and whatever it had shown me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold air stinging my face. I don't know what happened in that asylum. I don't know who that woman was, or what her scream meant. But I know one thing for certain. The asylum wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to hear its stories, to walk its halls, and to feel its pain. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had heard it. But it wasn't done with me yet. The scream still echoes in my mind. The rain had been falling steadily for hours by the time I arrived at the old inn. The kind of rain that taps at the windows like a gentle but persistent knock. A sound that makes the world outside seem distant, as though it's all happening in another reality. I had been on the road all day, and though I wasn't exactly thrilled about staying in a place like this, it was the only inn for miles. The sign hanging outside was worn, its letters faded from years of exposure to the elements. but it still stood, as if waiting for someone like me to pass through its creaking door. I had driven through the storm, my wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour, and the road had felt endless, twisting and turning through thick trees that obscured any sign of civilization. When I spotted the inn, I was more than ready to stop. The building itself seemed ancient, with a sagging roof and peeling paint. The windows were half covered with heavy curtains, but light spilled from behind them, casting long shadows on the wet ground outside. It wasn't inviting, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. The innkeeper, a woman in her mid-50s with tired eyes and an unnerving smile, welcomed me inside. She didn't ask many questions, just handed me a key with the number 309 written on the tag, and pointed me toward the stairs without saying much else. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something I couldn't quite place. The kind of voice that made you feel like you were being watched, even when no one was around. I thanked her, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had been traveling for hours, and the only thing I could think of was getting to my room and getting some rest. The hallway was long, lined with old, dark wood paneling, and the floors creaked with each step. It was as though the entire building was breathing with me, alive in a way that made my skin prickle. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder as I ascended. It was a strange chill, the kind that sinks into your bones. The hallway at the top was dimly lit, and the shadows stretched long, like arms reaching out to touch me. I glanced at the rooms as I walked past, but my eyes kept returning to the door at the very end of the hall. It had a strange aura about it, like it was calling to me. The number 309 was painted in chipped white letters on the door, but it was the odd sense of heaviness around it that made me pause. I was about to turn toward my own room, 307, but the innkeeper's words echoed in my mind. "Don't go near room 309, she had said, almost too quickly. Stay away from it. Don't look inside." There was something about the way she spoke, like she had seen something, experienced something in that room that had left her rattled. But she didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Of course, I didn't listen to her. I was curious, and in my exhaustion, I couldn't ignore the pull of that door. I had to know why she had warned me. Maybe it was the rain, the isolation. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move in the hallway, but something urged me toward it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. The faintest sound reached my ears, a low hum, like an old, forgotten song playing from behind the door. I could almost hear the echo of voices, faint whispers that seemed to drift through the cracks in the wood. It was odd, unsettling, and I felt a chill in my chest as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked as I turned it, the sound seeming to grow louder in the silence of the hall. I pushed it open slowly, a rush of stale air brushing past my face. The room beyond was dark, the curtains drawn tightly, blocking any light from outside. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my feet, and the hum of something just out of reach seemed to grow stronger. I glanced around. The room was small, just a bed, a nightstand, and a faded armchair near the window. Nothing out of the ordinary, at first glance. But there was something unsettling about the room. The walls were lined with dark wallpaper, patterned with designs that seemed too intricate, too precise. The room felt colder than the hallway, as if the air itself had been trapped here for years, suspended in time. I moved toward the bed, my heart racing as I noticed something odd. The sheets on the bed were perfectly made, but there was something about them that looked wrong, as though they had been smoothed over too many times, too perfectly. I reached out, my fingers brushing the fabric, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, causing the curtains to flutter. The whispers returned, louder now, almost clear, but still too faint to make out. I turned quickly, my gaze shifting to the armchair. It sat in the corner, facing the window, as if someone had just gotten up and left. A faint impression of a body still lingered in the cushion, as though it had been occupied not long ago. I felt a strange pull toward it, as if it was waiting for me to sit down, to feel the weight of whoever had been there before me. But then, I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound. A whisper clear and direct. *Leave now. The voice was sharp, almost a command, and my blood turned cold. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun toward the door, but it was already too late. The room seemed to be shifting, the shadows stretching longer, the air growing thicker. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm, but I couldn't make sense of the words. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in my ears, and in my mind. I felt a sudden weight on my chest, a crushing pressure, as though the room was closing in on me. I gasped for air, but the suffocating feeling only intensified. My eyes darted around the room, desperate to find an escape, but nothing seemed familiar anymore. The door was gone, or maybe I had never really seen it. All I could see were the shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being trapped in a place that had never wanted me there. I stumbled back, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The temperature dropped further, and I could feel the presence of something, or someone, moving behind me. The armchair creaked as though someone had just sat down. The whispers were deafening now, but no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't understand them. And then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a figure stood. A shape, shrouded in darkness, but unmistakable. A woman. Her back was turned, but her presence was undeniable. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, like a sentinel, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I felt my legs give way beneath me, and I sank to the floor, my hands pressed to my ears, trying to block out the whispers that were now a cacophony of voices, screaming in my mind. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling in that dark room, but eventually, the whispers faded. The woman was gone. The room was silent again, the shadows once again stretching out of my sight. I found myself crawling toward the door, or where I thought the door was. When I reached out to touch the handle, it turned easily in my hand. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I left room 309, the door closing behind me with a quiet click. I didn't go back to my room, didn't go to the innkeeper to ask about what had happened. I left the inn that night, walking through the rain without a destination, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. I never spoke of what happened in room 309, and I never went back. But sometimes, when the rain taps softly on the window, I hear the whispers again, just on the edge of my hearing. And when I close my eyes, I still see her standing in that dark room, waiting for me to come back. The hospital was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's footsteps echoing down the sterile hallways. I had been sitting in the waiting area for hours, my mind racing with anxiety. My brother, Sean, had been rushed in earlier that morning after a car accident, and I hadn't heard any updates since. The only sound in the dimly lit waiting room was the muffled beep of the heart monitor, its rhythmic pulse too steady to feel reassuring. I had been pacing the hall, walking from one side of the waiting area to the other, trying to calm my nerves when I decided to step out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I stepped into the corridor, a low buzz accompanying the erratic strobe of light. The hall stretched out ahead, long and narrow, with the stark white walls giving it the sterile feeling of a place that should have been empty. But it wasn't. I wasn't the only person here. There had to be others, right? Staff moving between rooms, other visitors in the waiting areas, people wandering the corridors like me. But as I glanced down the hall, I noticed how still it was, how quiet. The sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint smell of disinfectant was almost suffocating. The silence felt suffocating, too, pressing in on me, the oppressive stillness making it harder to breathe. I was certain I had seen other people in the hallway when I first arrived. Nurses, patients being wheeled past, hospital attendants cleaning up spills or pushing carts. But now, the hallway felt empty, almost as if I had stepped into another dimension where time and space no longer had meaning. The flickering lights grew more intense. One overhead light blinked twice, then dimmed to a near-extinguished state. I flinched involuntarily, the noise of the flickering bulb amplifying in the silence around me. My eyes were drawn upward, following the erratic glow of the lights, but nothing seemed to happen. There was no one in sight, no movement, no sounds other than the mechanical hum of the hospital itself. I shook my head, trying to shake off the rising unease. It wasn't uncommon for hospital lights to flicker from time to time, especially in an old building like this. I just needed to calm down, to focus on my brother. I started to walk down the hallway, keeping my eyes fixed ahead, trying to ignore the growing sense that I wasn't truly alone. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the walls seemingly shifting with every step. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, and I couldn't help but feel like they were too loud in the silence, like they were drawing unwanted attention. It wasn't until I reached the end of the hallway, near the corner, that I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, its frame covered in shadows. It was strange, almost hidden, like it wasn't meant to be there. The door wasn't marked on the hospital map, nor had I seen it when I first walked down the corridor. It wasn't a room I recognized. I stopped. A shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but there was something unsettling about it, something unnatural, a pull that made me want to turn away, to walk in the opposite direction, back toward the safety of the waiting room. But I couldn't help myself. The door seemed to beckon me, drawing me closer with an invisible force. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved toward it, the air growing colder with each step. As I reached the door, the flickering lights above me suddenly stopped. The hallway plunged into darkness for a moment, then blinked back to life. I flinched at the sudden shift, but it didn't stop me from pushing the door open. It creaked in protest, the sound echoing far louder than it should. have in the silence of the corridor. Inside, the room was dimly lit. I could barely make out the shapes. The shadows of medical equipment standing like forgotten monuments in the corners of the room. It looked like a storage closet of sorts, filled with unused supplies. But there was something wrong with it. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as though it had been sealed off for years. My breath seemed to catch in my throat as I took another step inside, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost didn't register it. At first, the faintest rustle, like paper shifting in the breeze. I froze. My pulse quickened. The noise seemed to come from the back of the room, from the far corner where the shelves stood. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shifting shapes. And then I saw it. A shadow. It was moving. Just barely. Too quick to be a trick of the light. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped backward. But something stopped me. The sound again, this time louder. A soft scraping, like nails against metal. I couldn't move. I stood there in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the shifting shadows, unable to look away. The noise grew louder, the scraping more distinct, and that's when I noticed it. A figure, hunched in the corner, its shape just visible in the dim light. It was too still, too unnatural. The figure twitched. I couldn't breathe. And then, in that unbearable silence, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat, but unmistakable. Leave. I gasped. My legs. Finally reacting to the fear coursing through me. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me with a force that echoed through the hallway. My breathing was ragged as I ran down the corridor, past the flickering lights, my footsteps louder now, frantic. I didn't stop until I reached the waiting room, where the normal, everyday noise of the hospital seemed to drown out everything else. I collapsed into the nearest chair, my hands trembling in my lap. I tried to steady my breath, but the image of that figure, of the shadow, moving in that dim room, lingered in my mind. The whisper, the feeling of being watched, of being pulled toward that room kept spinning through my thoughts. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it had just been my imagination, a product of the stress and the worry, for Sean. But the longer I sat there, the more unsettled I felt. The lights flickered once more above me, a brief stutter in their hum. I looked toward the hallway. The door to the room I had seen, the one I hadn't known was there, was now shut. I didn't know what was in there. I didn't know what was waiting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had been waiting for me, too, and I had looked. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, but it still held an unnerving kind of presence. When I first arrived, the building loomed like a forgotten monument to a past that was too dark to face. The air outside was damp, thick with the scent of decaying wood and rusted metal. The sky above was covered in gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves had drawn a veil over the place. I had heard the rumors, of course, who hadn't? Stories about the asylum's twisted history, the experiments that were conducted in the name of science, the patients who had never left. It had been shut down after the tragic death of a doctor who was supposedly driven to madness by his own experiments. The doors had been locked, the windows boarded up, and eventually it had faded from memory. a relic of a past that no one cared to revisit. Except me. I wasn't scared. At least I told myself I wasn't. I had always been drawn to the abandoned places, left untouched by time, and there was something about the asylum's isolation that called to me. I didn't expect to find anything in there. Not really. Just the usual scraps, dust-covered furniture, old papers, perhaps some broken equipment. But what I found, tucked away in the darkest corner of the building, was far more than I had bargained for. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the sound of my footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The place was a labyrinth of abandoned rooms, all of them locked or barricaded in some way. There were no signs of life. The air felt stagnant, suffocating, and I could almost hear the echoes of voices long gone, lingering like ghosts in the corners of the walls. Then I found it. In a small room that appeared to have been a storage area, half hidden beneath a pile of old files and broken furniture, I saw something that didn't belong. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and weathered, with a small iron key attached to the spine. I don't know why I picked it up. Something about it seemed out of place, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. The moment my fingers brushed against it, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. But I opened it anyway, curiosity outweighing the unease I felt. The first page was filled with careful, cramped handwriting. It was dated, the entries spanning from months before the asylum had shut down. The handwriting was shaky, sometimes almost illegible, but I could make out enough to realize that this journal had not been written by a patient. It wasn't written by anyone who had been meant to be in this place at all. The pages were filled with descriptions of the building itself, but not as a doctor would observe it. These were personal notes, detailing the writer's experiences as though they were an outsider, an intruder. The first few entries were mundane. Notes about the hospital's layout, the state of the rooms, the equipment left behind. But as I turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The handwriting grew erratic, sometimes barely legible. And the further I read, the more disjointed the entries became. The writer began to describe strange occurrences, little things that made no sense, but were all too real to ignore. Sounds in the walls, whispers in the night, shadows moving where there were no people. A chill that couldn't be explained, growing colder with each passing day. The journal spoke of a man named Dr. Calloway, one of the lead doctors at the asylum, whose experiments were growing increasingly disturbing. The writer mentioned finding files hidden in the doctor's office, files that detailed procedures meant to manipulate the mind, to break it and rebuild it in ways that weren't natural, even by the standards of the time. But there was something more. The journal spoke of something darker, something that wasn't meant to be discovered, something the writer had found in the hidden wing of the asylum, a wing that no one had dared enter for years. I turned another page, and the words became harder to read. The entries were scattered now, fragmented thoughts written in a frenzy. The writer was becoming more frantic, describing how the building itself seemed to be changing. Hallways that weren't there before, doors that appeared where there had been none. The writer spoke of hearing voices, not from the patients, but from something else, something far older. It was as if the asylum was alive, watching them, waiting. And then came the last entry. It was barely legible, a scrawl of panicked words. and it sent a chill through me. The writer had found something in the deepest, darkest part of the asylum, something hidden, locked away for reasons the staff had never explained. The writer had entered the forbidden room, and there, they had found the truth. But the last line made my blood run cold. It simply read, "I'm not alone, and I'm not sure I can leave." I sat back, the journal slipping from my hands, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up as I reread that last line, my mind racing. The room around me felt colder, darker. My eyes darted around the room, but I could see nothing out of the ordinary. The journal, the key, the sense of something watching me, it all felt so real, so close. I don't know what I expected to find in the asylum, but it certainly wasn't this. The words in the journal seemed to linger in the air, pressing in on me. I felt a strange sense of being trapped, as though the asylum had drawn me in, as though it had known I would find this journal. Suddenly, the walls felt tighter, the air heavier. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to close on its own. But it remained open, the faint light from the cracked windows casting long shadows across the floor. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears, the faint rustling of paper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was just the wind, or the creaking of the building settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed the journal and the key, stuffing them into my bag with trembling hands, feeling the weight of both like a burden I wasn't prepared for. But as I turned to leave, the soft sound of footsteps echoed. Down the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. There was no one there. I turned, eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But everything remained still, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath. The door was still wide open. The sound of footsteps faded away, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was a quiet that stretched on too long, too thick, as if something unseen was waiting just out of view. I didn't wait another second. I rushed toward the exit, the walls seeming to close in around me, the hallway now stretching farther than it should have. The air grew colder, and I could almost hear someone, or something, behind me. I didn't look back, I couldn't. When I finally stepped out into the sunlight, the world outside seemed too bright, too sharp, in contrast to the darkness I had just left behind. The journal weighed heavily in my bag, and I didn't stop walking until I was far away from the asylum, far from the dark, creeping presence that had drawn me in. But I still don't know what I found in that asylum, or who had written that journal, or why it was left for me to discover. I know only one thing for certain. The asylum hasn't forgotten me, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting for me to return. The rain had started just before sunset, a steady downpour that turned the world outside into a blur of gray. I had come to the house to settle in a state, to clear out the remnants of a life that had ended too soon. My grandmother's house. I hadn't seen it in years, not since she passed, but it still held a strange sense of familiarity, as though the walls themselves had stored away her essence. The scent of her perfume, the sound of her soft humming as she cooked, the way the light would filter through the curtains in the morning. All of it was still here, as if she might walk through the door at any moment. I hadn't been prepared for how it would feel to return. The house had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary of sorts, but now it felt empty, hollow, as if it had lost its soul. The rooms were all the same, but somehow different. Dust had settled over the furniture, the shelves had collected layers of forgotten memories, and the ticking of the old clock in the hallway seemed louder than it ever had before. It was as if the house was still waiting, still holding on to something, unwilling to let go. I started upstairs, carrying a box to fill with the few items I wanted to keep. The creak of the wooden steps under my weight sounded strange now, like a distant echo from another time. I reached the top of the stairs, where the hallway stretched before me, leading to the rooms where I had spent so many childhood nights. I passed by the rooms, my footsteps soft against the worn floorboards, until I reached the door at the end of the hall. Her bedroom. The door had always been left open when I was younger. My grandmother had never locked it, always inviting me in with a smile, a cup of tea, or a story about the old days. I hadn't been inside since her funeral. There was no reason to go in, not really. I had been avoiding it, not sure what I might feel if I stepped back inside. But now, standing in front of the door, I couldn't resist. I pushed it open. Room was exactly as I remembered it. The same floral wallpaper, the same lace curtains, the same wooden furniture. The bed sat against the far wall, its dark mahogany frame as sturdy as ever. The quilt my grandmother had made, patched and worn, was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and lavender lingered in the corners. I felt a lump form in my throat as I stood there, taking it all in. She had loved this room, had spent so many hours in it, and now it felt like a museum, a place frozen in time. I set the box down beside the bed, trying to keep my emotions in check. I wasn't ready to go through her things, not yet, but I couldn't leave the room without taking a moment to remember. I ran my fingers lightly over the quilt, feeling the worn fabric beneath my touch. It was strange, the way memories could flood back so quickly, so isolated. It was as if she were still here, in the room with me. That's when I noticed it. The bed, it was still made, but the covers were slightly askew. Not much, just a small shift in the sheets, as though someone had recently moved beneath them. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down my spine. I was sure I hadn't disturbed the bed. I hadn't even sat down. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and this room had been untouched since her death. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. There, beneath the quilt, was the unmistakable outline of a figure, a body, a form that looked as though it were still lying in the bed, tucked under the covers. I stood there, staring at the indentation in the sheets, unable to move. My mind raced. I told myself it was impossible, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I slowly reached out, my hand trembling as I lifted the edge of the quilt. Beneath the fabric, there she was, my grandmother. She looked just as she had when she was alive. Her white hair framed her face, her hands folded neatly across her chest. Her skin, pale and smooth, looked almost too real, too perfect. She was lying in the bed as though she were sleeping, but the room was so still, so silent, that I couldn't breathe. She was dead. I knew that. I had seen her body laid to rest, had watched as they lowered her into the ground. But here she was, in the same bed, looking as if nothing had changed. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind spun in confusion. How could this be? How could she be here? I had never heard of anything like this before. The rational part of me screamed that it was impossible, that this was some trick of the mind, a vivid hallucination brought on by grief or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my fingers still trembling as I reached out to touch her hand. Her skin was cold, colder than it should have been. The moment my fingers brushed against her, something inside me snapped. I pulled my hand away, a scream caught in my throat. I turned away from the bed, my pulse racing, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the door. But then I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. A whisper, Alice, my name. It was her voice. It came from the bed, faint but clear, as though she were speaking directly to me. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no mistaking it. It was her voice, but she had been dead for years. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly, my body heavy with dread. The bed was empty. The covers were smooth once more, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. The room was still, silent. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted around the room, but it was exactly as it had been when I first stepped inside. The same bed, the same quilt, the same silence. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. Alice, leave. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was no one there, no sign of her. The room was empty. It was only me, alone. I didn't know how long I stood there, my body frozen in place, staring at the bed. My mind unable to make sense of what had just happened. I turned toward the door, my legs shaking as I rushed out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the house. I didn't stop until I was outside, the rain falling around me in heavy sheets, the world a blur. I don't know what happened in that room. I don't know if it was a trick of my mind or something else entirely, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, in that bed, waiting for me to come back. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear her voice again, soft and clear, whispering my name, telling me to leave. But it's too late. It was a late afternoon when I found myself standing in the lobby of the old building, waiting for the elevator. The day had been long, and the air outside was thick with humidity, making the journey from my office to this place feel like an eternity. The building, though, was the kind of place I had grown accustomed to. Old, but with a certain charm. It wasn't modern or sleek like the high-rises downtown. Instead, it had a faded grandeur, the kind you find in places that have outlived their time. The marble floors were worn from years of footsteps, and the elevator, an old-fashioned metal contraption, was slow and creaky. I had come here for a simple reason, to visit a friend who worked on one of the upper floors. She had invited me to meet her after work, and I figured it would be a nice way to unwind. It wasn't my first time in the building, but each time I came, I noticed something strange. Something about the way the hallways seemed to stretch on longer than they should, or the way the elevator would occasionally stop between floors, as if unsure where it was supposed to go, but I never thought too much of it. The building was old, after all. and these quirks didn't seem that unusual to me. I pressed the button for the elevator, the familiar ding sounding as the doors opened. The interior was just as I remembered it. Polished brass and worn velvet cushions on the walls. The elevator was small, barely able to hold a few people comfortably, but I didn't mind. It had a certain old-world charm. I stepped inside and pressed the button for my friend's floor, the 5th one, and waited. The doors closed with a soft clink, and the elevator began its slow ascent. But then something strange happened. The elevator didn't stop at the 5th floor. I had been watching the numbers light up on the panel as the elevator climbed 1st floor, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then it passed the 5th floor entirely. My brow furrowed in confusion, and I leaned forward slightly, watching the numbers continue to rise. The 6th floor, then the 7th. I hadn't noticed the building had this many floors. It was an old structure, and I was certain my friend worked on the 5th floor. I pressed the button for the 5th floor again, hoping it was just a mistake. But the elevator didn't respond. It kept rising, the numbers ticking off one by one, until it reached the 8th. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't right. I had been in this elevator before, and I was certain I knew the layout of the building. There was no 8th floor. The building had always had 7 floors. At least that's what I had assumed from the floor plan I had seen. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe the elevator was malfunctioning. Maybe there was some hidden level that was used for maintenance or storage. But it didn't make sense. The elevator stopped. I hadn't heard the familiar ding that usually announced the floor. The doors opened silently, and I stepped out cautiously, my heart beating faster now. The hallway beyond the elevator was dark, lit only by a single dim light at the far end. The walls were painted a dull beige, and the carpet beneath my feet was worn and faded. The hallway seemed wrong somehow, like it had been untouched for years. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, making your skin prickle. I looked around, but there was no sign of any office doors, no indication of where I was supposed to go. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors had already closed. I tried pressing the button to call it again, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. I was alone, standing in a hallway that shouldn't have existed. I took a few tentative steps forward, my shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. As I walked down the corridor, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There were no signs, no labels on the doors. Nothing that identified what this floor was. The farther I walked, the more the hallway seemed to stretch out, as though it was expanding with every step I took. I rounded a corner, and there, at the end of the hall, I saw a door, an old wooden door, almost hidden by the shadows. It looked like an office door, but it was far too worn, far too aged for a building like this. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I thought I heard the faintest sound, a whisper. The voice was too faint to make out, but it was unmistakable. I couldn't tell if it was a person or the wind, but it tugged at something inside me, urging me to investigate. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. My breath quickened, my nerves stretched taut with every step, but the door seemed to call me. I reached for the handle and pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning with the effort. Inside was another hallway, identical to the one I had just walked down. The air was colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the hallway stretched out into infinity. I could feel something watching me from the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just the dim light flickering at the end of the hall, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I imagining this? Had I wandered into some part of the building that no one had been to in years? I backed away from the door, but the moment I turned around, I froze. The hallway behind me had changed. The elevator doors weren't where they had been. Instead, I found myself standing at the end of a long, narrow corridor, and the elevator, the one I had arrived in, was nowhere to be found. Panic began to rise in my chest. I had to get out of here. I tried walking back down the hallway, hoping to retrace my steps, but each turn I took led me into another corridor, another stretch of shadow and silence. The building had become a maze, its walls shifting and stretching like the inside of a dream. I wasn't sure how long I had been wandering. The feeling of being lost, utterly lost, was suffocating, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to exist. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn around and find the elevator, but every hallway seemed to lead me further away, further into the unknown. And then, I heard the faintest sound again, a whisper, soft and clear. This time, it came from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, save for the flickering lights. My heart raced as I tried to understand what was happening, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the building was closing in on me. The walls seemed to press closer, the air heavier. I turned again, hoping to find some exit, some way out of this place. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The number on the door in front of me was 300. I had seen that number before. It had been on the elevator panel when I first got in. I stepped closer, my feet moving almost on their own. The door creaked open, and I walked inside, but the room was empty. Just an old, decrepit office, filled with dusty furniture and papers scattered on the floor. But the moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered out completely, and I was plunged into darkness. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then, through the darkness, I heard it. A faint, distant sound, almost like a soft click. And then, the unmistakable sound of the elevator dinging in the distance. But it wasn't the elevator I had come in. The building had changed again, and now it was waiting for me to find the next door. It was the smell that first hit me, sterile, sharp, and cold, like something had been cleaned too many times, yet never truly cleaned at all. I had entered the hospital under strange circumstances. It wasn't a regular visit. No, I hadn't come here to see a friend or to visit a family member. I wasn't even supposed to be here, but it didn't matter. The doors had been left ajar, and something inside me made me step through, something I couldn't explain. The hospital was abandoned, or at least, it seemed abandoned. The walls were cracked, the ceiling tiles sagging with the weight of time and neglect. The air felt thick, cloying, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows across the hallway as I moved deeper into the building. There were no signs of life, no sounds, save for the soft hum of the occasional flickering fluorescent light. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if the place had been frozen in time, untouched, but waiting. I wasn't sure what drew me here. Perhaps it was the rumors, the stories of this place, of patients who had disappeared, of the failed experiments, of the rumors that whispered about things far worse than medical procedures. But there was something about the building that captivated me, that called to me, something that made me feel as though I was meant to find what was hidden here. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The sound felt too loud in the empty space, too clear in the silence. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the hospital doors as I passed. The faint hum of electricity, the only company I had. I wasn't sure where I was going. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But something pushed me forward. The doors to the operating room were heavy, old, and unmarked, the steel handles cold to the touch. I pulled one open and stepped inside, the light from the hallway casting a dull, sickly glow across the sterile room. It looked like any operating room I had seen before, all white and stainless steel, with a large, intimidating operating table in the center, surrounded by medical equipment. It was the kind of place that should have felt clinical, clean, and safe. But it didn't. The air was thick, as if it had been trapped here for too long. I looked around, unsure of what I was hoping to find. The walls were lined with cabinets, some open, some closed. The counters were cluttered with old, dusty tools, scalpels, syringes, scissors, all the familiar instruments of a surgical procedure. But there was something else, something out of place. The operating table. It was covered in dark, crimson stains. At first, I thought it was rust or old paint, but no. As I stepped closer, my heart clenched in my chest. The stains were fresh, the color too vibrant to have been left behind for years. I stood there, staring at it, frozen in place. The stains soaked into the white sheets, spreading out in uneven patterns, as though someone had been lying there, bleeding, not long ago. There was no sign of anyone, no body, no movement, just the bloodstains pooling across the table. I swallowed hard, stepping closer, my breath shallow. The faint smell of iron of blood hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as the floor beneath my feet felt less stable, more uncertain. I reached out, my hand trembling as I hovered over the bloodstains, unsure of what to do. I had no idea who had been here before, or what had happened, but the presence of the blood was undeniable. It wasn't just the stains on the table, it was everywhere, in the air, in the room itself. It felt like the room was alive with it, as though the blood had seeped into the walls, into the floors. I turned, suddenly aware of the silence that filled the room. The weight of the stillness pressed on my mind. I needed to leave. The urge to run, to escape, to get out of that room and away from the blood was overwhelming. But just as I stepped back, I heard it. A soft, unmistakable sound. The faintest click, like a switch being thrown, like something had been activated. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The door behind me, the one I had come through, was now shut. The latch had clicked into place, locking me in. I didn't hear anyone come in. There were no footsteps, no voices. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The bloodstains on the table hadn't changed. but something else had. The room felt different, as though it had shifted, as if the space I was standing in was no longer the same as when I had entered. The air was colder now, and the shadows seemed deeper, stretching toward me in unnatural angles. I turned toward the corner of the room, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as I focused, my breath caught. It was a person, or something like a person. A figure, tall and thin, shrouded in a hospital gown, standing motionless in the corner. Their head was tilted unnaturally, their face obscured by the shadows, but the feeling of being watched, of being observed, washed over me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence filling the room, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. It felt wrong, like something that didn't belong, something that had been locked away for a reason. I took a step back, my body trembling. The air was growing thicker, the room more suffocating. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to see its face. And when I did, my blood ran cold. It was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide and glassy, locked on me in an unblinking stare. There were no words, no movement, just that awful, empty gaze that seemed to pierce through me. I turned again, my heart hammering, and this time, I ran. I rushed to the door, banging on it with all my strength, my breath ragged and frantic. But the door wouldn't budge. I pulled, I pushed, I screamed, but nothing worked. The room seemed to stretch out further, the walls closing in, the bloodstains on the operating table still fresh, still there. And then, the whisper came. So soft, I barely heard it. But it was there, like a breath in my ear, like something was speaking directly to me. Asterisk, you're not supposed to leave. Asterisk, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls, and I realized then that I had never been alone. The bloodstains, the figure, the feeling of something waiting, it had all been a warning, but I was already trapped, and there was no way out. The hospital had always been one of those places that seemed frozen in time. The walls were a dull, peeling yellow, the floors creaked with every step, and the air felt perpetually cool, with the faint scent of antiseptic that lingered long after the cleaning had finished. It wasn't a modern place, the kind of sterile, shiny hospital you see on TV. No, this place had history, the kind of history that made you feel like something was always lurking just behind the walls, waiting for its moment to be remembered. I had arrived late in the evening, tired and disoriented after a long day of traveling. The place wasn't far from the city, just a small hospital tucked away on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and isolation. I had been given a room on the third floor, an old, quiet part of the building. The receptionist had handed me the key without much fuss, but her expression had been strange, a mixture of unease and pity that I couldn't quite understand. As she gave me the room key, she whispered something under her breath. It was almost inaudible, but I caught it. Don't trust the nurses. I had thought little of it at the time. Hospitals had a way of making people nervous, and she was probably just an overworked employee with an imagination. I smiled politely, thanked her, and made my way up to the third floor. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I felt it. The air was heavy, dense, as if the building had been holding its breath for years. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by flickering lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The walls were lined with old, metal doors, each one leading to rooms that seemed untouched, preserved in a state of suspended animation. Everything felt quiet, too quiet. Even the occasional echo of footsteps from other patients or staff seemed muffled, as though the sound itself was afraid to disturb the silence. The nurses' station was at the end of the hall, and I walked past it, glancing briefly at the woman sitting there, bent over some paperwork. She didn't look up, but I noticed the strange, rigid way she moved, her hands stiff as she flipped through the pages. It wasn't until I reached my room that I felt the weight of what the receptionist had said. Asterisk, don't trust the nurses. I hadn't paid it any mind earlier, but now, in the stillness of the hallway, it echoed in my mind. It wasn't the first time I had heard something strange about this place. I entered my room, the door creaking slightly as I pushed it open. The room was small, sparse. A single bed with a thin blanket, a small table by the window, and a nightstand with an old-fashioned lamp. The window was cracked, letting in just a small amount of cold air, and I immediately noticed how quiet it was. There was no sound outside, no cars passing, no wind rustling through the trees, just nothing. I sat on the bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my chest. I had come here for rest, a break, to forget the stresses of my life. But something about this place, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was as if the building itself was waiting, holding something back, hiding something beneath the surface. That night, I barely slept. The hallways outside my door seemed to come alive. Footsteps, soft at first, then louder, growing closer, then fading again, as if someone were walking just outside my room. I lay still, listening. It was always the same soft footsteps, a rustle of fabric, the sound of something being dragged along the floor. But when I got up to check, the hallway was empty still. The nurse's station was quiet, the light dim. At around 3 a.m., the door to my room opened without warning. I jumped up, startled, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the doorway was a nurse, tall, dressed in an old, faded uniform, her face obscured by the dim light. She didn't speak, but she looked at me with cold, empty eyes, her expression unreadable. I froze, unsure what to say, unsure what was happening, but she didn't wait for me to respond. She just stood there, unmoving, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. Finally, she stepped inside, and as she did, I noticed that her steps were unnaturally quiet, almost too soft for someone in a uniform. She didn't make any noise at all, and that was when I saw it. The way her hands hung by her sides, unnaturally stiff, almost rigid. Her eyes, too, were wrong, too blank, too vacant. She wasn't alive in the way that people usually were. I tried to speak, tried to ask her what she needed, but no words came out. It was like the air around me had been sucked dry. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy, as if something was pressing against me. The nurse walked toward the bed, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. She didn't say anything, didn't even look at me as she placed a small tray on the table by my bedside. And then, without a word, She turned and left. The door clicked shut behind her, with a sound that seemed far too loud for such a quiet place. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I spent hours lying in bed, wide awake, my heart racing, my mind filled with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? What was she doing? And why was the air so thick with something I couldn't explain? The next morning, when I went to the nurse's station to ask about the strange visit, I was met with nothing but confusion. The nurse I had spoken to was there, but she didn't seem to remember anything. She said no one had entered my room, and the other nurses I asked claimed the same. They were all too busy, too professional. But I knew what I saw. I knew she had been there. That evening, the same thing happened again. A nurse came into my room, just like before, but this time, it wasn't one I had seen. Another tall figure. In a faded uniform, eyes vacant, hands stiff. She stood there, stared at me, and again, placed the tray on the table without a word. I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. She turned and left, and just like the night before, the door clicked shut with an eerie finality. I didn't leave my room that night, or the next. I couldn't. The hallway outside had become unbearable, the whispers too loud, the sound of footsteps too real. And then I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had been hearing them not just in the hall, but in my own room. The soft rustling, the whisper of fabric, the low sound of someone walking in place. They were here, in my room. Watching, I decided to leave the next morning, but when I stepped out of the room, the hallway had changed. The nurses were there, standing in the doorway of each room, their eyes fixed on me, waiting, their hands stiff, their gaze cold, and for the first time, I noticed the faint smell of something old, something decayed, something that had been there for far too long. And in that moment, I realized the truth. They weren't just nurses. They were part of the building, part of something that had never left. They were waiting for me to stay, to become a part of them. I left the hospital that day, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint sound of someone walking, waiting, and I know they're still there, still watching, and they'll never leave. The moment I stepped onto the grounds of the abandoned asylum, I felt it. A weight, not one that I could see or touch, but something deep in the air, hanging around me like an invisible presence. It was an old place, the kind of building that had a story, one that most people would rather forget. And maybe I should have forgotten about it too. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the asylum, something about its dark, crumbling walls that called to me. I had read about it, of course. The town's history was riddled with whispers of the asylum's twisted past. People who had vanished, staff members who were said to have been driven mad, and of course, the patients who never left. The building had been abandoned for decades, but the rumors never died. It was said that the place was haunted, that the spirits of the people who died there still wandered its halls, trapped by some unspeakable force. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. At least I didn't think I did. But curiosity had always been my undoing, and when I found out the asylum was abandoned and left to rot, I knew I had to see it for myself. Something told me that I needed to be here, even if I wasn't entirely sure why. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the still air. And I stepped onto the overgrown path that led up to the front door. The trees around the building were tall, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. The air felt thick, damp with the scent of wet earth and mildew. The building itself stood like a dark monolith, its broken windows staring down at me, empty eyes that seemed to follow my every move. I hesitated at the threshold. The door was half open, the hinges rusted and broken, as though someone had long ago forgotten it existed. The inside of the building was cloaked in darkness, and I stood there for a moment, looking into the blackness, my heart thudding in my chest. I could feel the pulse of the place, the quiet rhythm of its decaying walls, as if the building was breathing, waiting for me. I stepped inside. The air was colder than I expected, a sharp chill that prickled my skin. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floors were littered with debris, and the faint smell of something old and musty hung in the air. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. As I moved deeper into the building, the darkness seemed to close in around me. It was like walking through a dream, one that I couldn't quite escape. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms, the weight of the place growing heavier with each step. The walls were lined with old doors, each one closed, hiding something that I didn't want to find. I was drawn toward one of the rooms, room 209, marked on the faded plaque beside the door. The door was cracked slightly open, and I could feel the pull of it, like something was waiting inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the door, but something inside me urged me to open it. I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, just like the others, but there was something about it that felt different. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and the dim light from the broken window cast strange shadows on the walls. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the bed. It was the same as the others. A simple metal frame with a thin mattress, but the bed was covered in dark stains, red and brown, as though someone had been here recently. It looked fresh, as though the blood had only just dried, but it couldn't have been. The place had been abandoned for years. The thought made my stomach turn. I stepped back, my mind racing. It wasn't just the bloodstains that disturbed me. It was the feeling, the sense that someone was still here, still watching me. Looked around the room, my pulse quickening, my skin crawling. But the room was empty, save for the debris on the floor and the remnants of old papers scattered across the desk. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her hair disheveled, her face hollow. She was wearing a hospital gown, the fabric stained with something dark. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes, her face expressionless. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could hear the faintest whisper, like a voice calling from the depths of the building. I didn't wait to find out more. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the hall, my footsteps slamming against the floor, each one louder than the last. I couldn't escape the feeling that the building was alive, that it was watching me, following me as I ran. The hallway stretched on, longer than it should have, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper with every turn I took. I reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned in my hand, but the door wouldn't budge. I yanked at it, my breath ragged, but it felt like the building had closed itself off, trapping me inside. I stepped back, trying to control my panic, but the shadows around me seemed to close in, as though they were alive, moving toward me. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The hallway that I had just come from had changed. The walls were now lined with photographs, old black and white photos of patients. Some smiling, some with vacant stares, all staring back at me with eyes that seemed too real. I couldn't breathe. It felt as though the building had swallowed me whole, as though it had drawn me in and would never let me go. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, soft at first, then growing louder, closer, as if someone was coming for me. I ran again, not knowing where I was going, but knowing I had to get out. The building seemed to shift with every step. The walls moving closer, the doors changing position, and the air growing colder with each breath I took. I didn't stop until I reached the front doors, and even then, they wouldn't open. I looked back once more, and the woman was standing there again, watching me from the darkness. That was when I realized the asylum wasn't abandoned. It was still alive. It was still watching, waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to understand what it had been holding on to all these years. But I couldn't leave. Not until it was ready to let me go. It all started with the smell. That faint, suffocating odor of mildew and old, stagnant air that seems to seep into every corner of an abandoned building. The hospital was decades old, and though it had been shut down for years, the faint echo of its past still lingered. I had heard rumors, of course. People in town would tell stories about the place. How it was abandoned after a series of mysterious events and strange disappearances. The tales were mostly whispers. Rumors passed in hushed voices behind closed doors. But there was always an undeniable sense of fear when the asylum was mentioned. And for some reason, that fear called to me. I had found out about the place by chance, a map tucked away in an old box in my aunt's attic, a map that marked the asylum, its dark history hinted at with just a single line, *caution, do not enter. It intrigued me. I couldn't resist. I had always been drawn to abandoned places, to the quiet that fell over them once the world had moved on, to the secrets they held in their dusty rooms. So, I made the decision. I would visit the asylum. A brief excursion, a few hours, and I'd be gone. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun still hanging high in the sky, casting long shadows over the building. The gates were rusted, barely hanging on their hinges, and the heavy iron door to the asylum was ajar. No locks. It was like the building had been waiting for someone to walk in. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and everything seemed to have been left in a state of suspension, as if the asylum had simply been abandoned midday without warning. The walls were peeling, the floors covered in grime, but there was still something hauntingly beautiful about it. The old, worn furniture, the faded photographs on the walls, now covered in cobwebs, all of it felt like a memory, a time that had been forgotten by the world. I wandered deeper into the building, moving through the hallways, past rooms filled with broken glass, overturned chairs, and dust-covered medical equipment. The silence was almost too loud, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, I found myself standing at the end of a long hallway, the dim light overhead flickering as it cast strange shadows on the walls. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of my footsteps echoing into the emptiness. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, as if the very walls were alive, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I turned to leave, but that's when I noticed it. The doors. At first, I thought I had simply passed them by without paying attention. But when I turned around, I saw that they were all closed. Each door on either side of the hallway was shut tight. I moved closer to one, reaching for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I tried the next one, then the next, my hands trembling as I pulled on each handle in turn. None of them opened. The strange thing was, I hadn't heard any sounds of locks clicking or doors closing. The hallway had been silent, but now, standing in front of these sealed doors, I couldn't help but feel as though they were all deliberately shut, as though the building itself was trying to trap me here, to keep me from leaving. I turned back, thinking perhaps there was another exit somewhere, maybe a window or a stairwell that would lead me out of this unnerving place. But the hallway I had just walked down was gone. The doors were still there, but the hallway itself seemed to have twisted, stretching into a different direction, as though the asylum itself was rearranging. I looked down at the floor, feeling the cold, damp air brush against my skin. The walls felt too close now, the space too narrow. I had entered this place with a sense of curiosity, eager to uncover whatever secrets it held. But now, I felt only the weight of something ancient, something oppressive, pressing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse, almost alive with the same breathless silence that filled every inch of this forsaken place. I turned back to the doors, trying each one again, pulling with all my strength, but the doors remained shut. The hallway stretched out in front of me like a never-ending tunnel. The faintest sound echoed through the walls, a whisper just out of reach, like something was breathing behind me, just beyond my sight. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, its cold shadows consuming the dim light. I felt a chill run through me, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. The building wasn't empty. There was something here with me. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel its presence, watching me, waiting. I backed away. From the doors, my pulse quickening. The walls seemed to close in on me. I had to find a way out. I had to leave. But the hallway had changed again. I could see the end of it now, the doors in the distance just barely visible through the shadows. I ran toward them, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the end, the doors were gone. There was no exit, no way forward, just the walls closer now, tighter, as if they were pressing me in, keeping me here. Panic flooded my chest. As I turned to look behind me, only to find the hallway had expanded again, lengthening into a new set of doors. I tried to reach them, but they, too, refused to open. I was trapped, stuck in a hallway that seemed to stretch forever, with doors that led nowhere. The whispering started again, soft at first, then growing louder. The walls seemed to hum with the sound, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that rattled my teeth. I pressed my back against the nearest door, my hands shaking as I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the air was thick now, and the floor felt uneven beneath my feet. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was just a silhouette at first, a shadow moving in the dim light, but as it grew closer, I could make out its shape. A woman, dressed in a hospital gown, her hair hanging limply around her face. She didn't move like a person. She glided silently, her feet barely touching the floor. Her eyes were wide, empty, staring straight at me, unblinking, unfeeling. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She stopped a few feet from me, and for a long, terrible moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Her eyes seemed to bore into me, into my soul, as if she could see all the things I had been running from. Then, without a word, she turned, walking toward the end of the hallway. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she were beckoning me to follow. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The walls seemed to grow tighter, the air colder, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I forced myself to take a step forward, but the moment I did, the hallway shifted once more. The doors I had seen before were now gone. The woman was gone. The hallway was empty, the whispering fading into the distance. I was still trapped. And the asylum had changed again. And I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't just stuck in a hallway. The asylum itself was alive, and it wasn't ready to let me go. The hospital had always been a strange place. I'd been working there for a few weeks, doing odd shifts, covering for staff who were out sick. But something about it unsettled me. It wasn't the patients. It wasn't the medical equipment or the long corridors lined with rooms. No, it was the way the building itself seemed to shift, like it was alive in some uncanny way. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was always something subtly off. The old ward was where I spent most of my time. It was a section of the hospital that had been closed off for years, its paint peeling and the air thick with dust. But they kept it open just in case they needed the extra beds. The walls were yellowed, the floor scuffed from years of wear, and the rooms were sparse, each one smelling faintly of antiseptic and mildew. I'd only worked a few shifts there, but each time I entered, it felt as though I was walking into a different version of the ward. A new arrangement of rooms, a new hallway, at first. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, late hours, fatigue, and the strange quiet of the place messing with my perception. But the more I worked there, the more I realized I wasn't imagining it. I remember one evening, clearly, the rain tapping softly against the windows, casting a dim, eerie light in the hall. It was late, well past midnight, and I had just finished my rounds. The hallways were quiet, eerily quiet. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls, and the floors creaked with every step I took. The hospital always felt cold at night, even in summer, but tonight it was especially cold, as if the air itself had turned to ice. I was heading back to the old ward to check on the few patients left, making sure everything was running smoothly. As I passed through the double doors leading into the ward, I noticed something odd. The hallway had changed. The left side of the hall, which I had sworn was empty only moments before, now had an additional door. I blinked, looking back down the hallway I had just come from. No door, just the same blank walls, the same fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I shrugged it off, thinking perhaps I had missed it before. I had been so focused on my work, I probably hadn't paid attention. But something gnawed at me. Something didn't feel right. I approached the door at the end of the hall, the one that had always been there, and noticed that it had changed too. It was the same door, but now it was slightly ajar. I was certain. It had been shut when I passed through here earlier. Curiosity got the best of me, so I stepped forward and pushed it open. Inside was just a small room with a single bed, an old chair, and a table. There was nothing unusual about it, except for the faint, musty smell that lingered in the air. As I stepped further in, I turned to look back toward the hallway. I wanted to check the time, see how long I'd been in there, and that's when I saw it. The hallway had changed again. The door I had just entered was now on the opposite side of the hall, further down, as if it had always been there. The hallway stretched longer than it had been before, the walls now covered with new, faded paintings. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I stared at the transformation. The layout, the doors, the walls, they were different, not just slightly altered, but completely changed. I backed out of the room and walked toward the door that I was sure had been at the far end of the hall. But as I approached it, it too had moved. Now, it was on the opposite side of where I had last seen it. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, bending, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Panic slowly began to seep into my thoughts. I took a deep breath, my hands beginning to shake. This doesn't make sense, I told myself. I'm just tired. I need sleep. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I felt the walls closing in. The flickering lights overhead seemed to pulse with a rhythmic intensity, casting shadows that twisted in strange patterns on the floor. The hallway, or rather, the ward, kept changing, morphing into new shapes every time I looked away. Each door, each window, each corner was different than the last. I couldn't find the exit. The more I walked, the more the ward seemed to stretch out ahead of me. The hallways were endless. I turned left, then right, and the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I should have known by then that the ward was alive, not in the traditional sense, but alive in its own twisted way, shifting to keep me trapped inside. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where you're trying to run but your legs won't move. Each hallway led to another, and each corner revealed something new, something darker. I thought I heard voices echoing in the distance, faint whispers that seemed to come from behind the walls. The further I went, the colder it became, and the lights overhead flickered more urgently. The buzzing noise, now an incessant hum in my ears. And then, the sound stopped. The lights stopped flickering. It was as if the entire ward had gone silent, holding its breath. I turned a corner, and for the first time, I saw something different. The walls weren't white anymore. They were dark, stained with old marks, handprints, smeared fingerprints that looked as though someone had been dragging themselves along the walls. The floor was slick with something dark, wet. I tried not to look too closely, but the smell hit me, then the sharp iron-like scent of blood. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized there was no way out. The ward had shifted completely. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, and the deeper I went, the less I recognized the space. The doors were no longer doors. They were just dark voids in the walls. The windows were boarded up, the light from outside fading into nothingness. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, their edges blurring in and out of focus. I found myself back at the beginning, standing in the same spot where I'd started at the entrance to the ward, but now it felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something that made my chest tighten. I turned, about to leave, but the hallway in front of me had shifted again. The door that had been there before was now a wall. The hallway was gone. I pressed my hand against the wall, trying to steady myself, but something pressed back. I could feel the heartbeat of the place beneath my fingers, rhythmic, slow, like a pulse running through the building itself. I took a step back, heart pounding, but when I turned to run, the hallway stretched out before me like an endless tunnel. The walls, the floors, the very air I was breathing felt wrong. The ward wasn't just a hospital. It was a maze, a labyrinth that didn't want to let me go. I don't know how long I was in there. Time felt like it had stopped, as though the ward had swallowed me whole and was keeping me trapped in its shifting corridors. I don't even remember how I left. I just know that when I finally stumbled out of the building, everything felt wrong, like I hadn't really left, like the hospital was still watching me. And every time I close my eyes, I feel the walls shifting, the corridors stretching, the doors moving. I don't go back anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, and I know the ward is still alive, and it's waiting for me to return. The hospital was quieter than usual that evening. The usual bustle of nurses and doctors had slowed, and the hallways were eerily still. I had been here all day, helping my friend Sarah, who had been admitted for a minor procedure. She was doing fine, recovering in her room, resting, but I couldn't seem to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over me the moment I arrived. There was something off about the hospital. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to feel uncomfortable. It was clean, modern, well lit. But something about the air in the building, something about the way the hallways seemed to stretch on forever, unsettled me. I kept hearing faint whispers, soft sounds that seemed to echo from nowhere, but when I'd turn around, there was nothing but the same sterile, quiet hospital environment. After a long day, I decided to step outside for a bit of fresh air. Sarah was sleeping soundly in her room, and I wanted to stretch my legs. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp, heavy with the scent of wet pavement and earth. I walked along the side of the building, the quiet of the night pressing in on me. I found a bench near a large window, one that overlooked the parking lot. The lights in the parking lot flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the pavement. The hospital building was dark in the distance, but the reflection in the window caught my eye. It was just a typical hospital window, a large rectangular panel of glass framed by thin, metal edges, the kind you see in every hospital corridor. I leaned against the frame, gazing out into the dark parking lot. For a moment, I simply enjoyed the peace, the solitude away from the sterile walls of the building, but as I stood there, something strange happened. I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection, just over my shoulder. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a distortion in the glass. But then I saw it clearly. A figure, a woman, standing just behind me in the reflection. She was dressed in a hospital gown, like me, and her long hair was dark and unkempt, falling in waves around her face. She was standing perfectly still, staring directly at me, her eyes wide open, almost lifeless. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I whirled around, but there was no one there. No figure, no woman. The bench where I had just been sitting was empty. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I had been in the hospital for too long, and the quiet had gotten to me. But then, I glanced back at the window. The woman was still there. In the reflection, she was standing in the same position, her face pale, her expression unreadable. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one behind me, but in the window, in the reflection, she was still there, staring directly at me. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. My eyes stayed locked on the window as I moved away from it. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, perfectly still, as though frozen in time, but I could feel her presence. I could feel the weight of her stare. I turned away quickly, walking away from the window, but I could still feel her watching me, as though her eyes had followed me, were still with me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It had to be some kind of trick. The reflection, the way the light had shifted, but as I rounded the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I hurried back into the hospital, the hallways feeling colder now, more oppressive. I could still see the woman's face in my mind, her wide, empty eyes. What had I seen in that reflection? It didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the fatigue, the isolation. But it wouldn't leave me, that feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached Sarah's room, I found her sleeping soundly, her breathing slow and steady. The room was quiet, the soft hum of the hospital machines the only sound filling the space. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to calm my racing heart. But something made me pause. The reflection in the window. It was right there, across from her bed, where I had left the blinds slightly open. The window was dark, the parking lot outside empty. But as I looked closer, I saw something move in the glass. The woman, she was there again, in the reflection, just behind Sarah's bed. Her pale face, her long hair, her lifeless eyes staring back at me. She wasn't standing at the window this time. She was closer, just inches away from Sarah, standing silently by her side. I rushed to the window, throwing open the blinds, my heart pounding in my chest. The outside was dark, still empty. There was no one there, no woman, no figure, just the parking lot, lit by the faint glow of streetlights. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. It was impossible. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. The woman in the reflection. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Her empty gaze, her still form always watching. Always there, lurking just outside the corner of my vision. And when I finally left the hospital the next day, I glanced back one last time, just to see the building from a distance, to see if I could put this all behind me. The windows were silent, empty, no reflection, but I knew, deep down, that the woman was still there, still waiting. And I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that I could never escape her. She was in the reflection, but not in the glass. She was in the hospital, in the walls, watching me. Always watching, and I could never leave her behind.